So I like vampires. I think they're very cool. I really enjoy the Fright Night remake starring Anton Yelchin. But it got me thinking, as many vampire stories as I have devoured in the past, I've never actually read the OG. Yes, while vampires have existed in folklore for probably thousands of years, it wasn't until the late 1800s when Mr. Stoker dropped this bad boy, when the world's perception of vampires sort of shifted. This book really needs no introduction, as literally every person on the planet has heard of it. It is one of, if not the most influential horror story of all time. To the point where when people think of a generic vampire, they usually think of Count Dracula. And I don't know if there are any other mythical horror creatures that are like that. There are very few pop culture icons that transcend their origin this much, and it's not just Dracula as well. Other characters in the book, such as Van Helsing, also, bring to mind the stereotypical archetype of a vampire hunter. Being over 100 years old, this book has been in the public domain for a long time. There have been countless adaptations, things that have taken inspiration from it. It's just one of the most easily recognizable stories of all time. But all that being said, it is over 100 years old. And nowadays, most people's first introduction to vampires is not going to be Dracula. In fact, a lot of people probably aren't even interested in reading the original book. But now with another new Dracula movie about to come out, I decided to take it upon myself to see what all the hype was about back in 1897. The story follows Jonathan Harker, an English solicitor who is invited by Count Dracula to his castle in Transylvania with the goal of helping him buy a house in London. And as Harker arrives, he begins to realize that things are a little bit odd about the mysterious Count. Jonathan never sees him eat, he never sees him during the day, and to say that there are some unexplained things going on during his nights at the castle would be an understatement. And things are about to get a whole lot spookier when Mr. Harker decides to ignore the Count's warnings and snoop around a little bit. Now, when I first mentioned that I was reading this book, I got a few comments that seemed to say the same thing. And as I did a bit of research, it seems like this tends to be a popular sentiment for this book. That is, many people consider to be the first section of this book, when Harker is at Dracula's castle, to be an absolute masterpiece of horror. And I would definitely agree with that. The first 4 chapters of this book are absolutely brilliant. Dracula is a very menacing character because he has such a warm, welcoming persona, but there are all these things he do that just feel a bit off. And then, all the spooky stuff that happens after, it's just so expertly built up and executed. Like, this really did lay the foundations for modern horror, and despite obviously knowing where it was going to go, I still had an absolute blast with this section of the story. But then there's like 350 more pages. So continuing on this opinion that a lot of people seem to have, is that while the first part of this is a masterpiece, the book then kinda falls off, at least for a lot of people. What happens afterwards is that Jonathan Harker has gone missing and his fiancée Mina is looking for him. Meanwhile, Mr. Dracula has hitched a ride on a ship over to London and is now causing havoc over there. So with the help of Mina's friends and the renowned Professor Van Helsing, they team up to try to get to the bottom of all of the weird things that have been going on. And what follows is basically the most standard by the numbers vampire story you can imagine. And you're saying, wait a minute, but this was like the first one like that. And yes, it absolutely was. I feel like the context of when this book came out is very important here. As while the story of this book is really nothing special if you have read dozens and dozens of vampire stories, but at the time, this was the vampire story. Nearly every trope we have come to associate with vampires comes from this book. While many of them were pulled from legends and folklore, some of them were Stoker's own creation. And I honestly found it really fascinating seeing the origins of a lot of these tropes. Like, while reading it, I could call pretty much every story beat, but I found myself still really enjoying the narrative, mostly for the novelty of it all. The characters don't have a ton of depth, but they are pretty fun and enjoyable. Their old-timey English dialogue was very fun, and I did really like them slowly coming to understand the nature of vampires. And again, while because of pop culture and the influence of this book, I could see pretty much every twist coming, they were still well executed. It is definitely a bit of a slow burn at the start. I think once the characters, start to learn a bit more about what's going on and they find find ways to, you know, fight back against Dracula, that's when things get really interesting again. I thought like the final chunk of this book, while the very ending might have been a bit anticlimactic, was a really fun ride, and thought it was almost as good as the first few chapters. But yeah, that is a bit of a problem where like the first 4 chapters are so incredibly good that it is a bit disappointing that the rest can't hold up to it. But overall, I still do think there is a lot of fun to be had here. Now, the book coming out of the 1800s is not just interesting because of its history of vampires and its influence on the horror genre, but this book tackles a lot of other themes as well. Specifically, how Stoker goes about exploring gender roles and sexuality. In a way, this book was pretty ahead of its time when it comes to subverting these roles, but it is also very much a product of its time in other ways. Again, why I think the context of when this book came out is very important. This book can also be interpreted to have a bit of a racial subtext in here, and one that has definitely not aged as gracefully. But I think what's great about the themes of this book is that they are very nuanced, and they don't just really spell things out for you. So if you sort of just want a vampire story and don't really want to engage with the themes of the time, some of which may not have aged well, then it is very easy to not focus on those at all. There is one gripe I have with this entire book, and that's sort of how it's told, and I haven't really talked about it yet. Dracula is famous for having a bit of an interesting style of storytelling. The entire book is told in journal entries and letters. And this is a very personal thing, but I'm not a huge fan of when books do this, because these letters and stuff are sort of just written like a POV chapter from the character in like any other book, in that it's heavy on the description. You like see all of the dialogue as it happens, and to me it just doesn't believably feel like these characters wrote it after the fact, and that's like canonically what's going on here. It's really not a big deal, and it's mostly a me thing, but like I do think there is a bit of immersion breaking here. I think I would have much rather if, you know, we could have included letters and journal entries, but then told most of the story in like a standard third person style. Because I was constantly thinking, man, there is so much detail in here, you would have to like literally be insane to write this all in your journal. What the heck? But that aside, I really enjoyed this book, although I think respect it more than anything. I do think it's an interesting story, and I think it was very fascinating seeing, you know, the origins of a lot of the type of vampire lore that we know. But I also definitely understand why people don't really vibe with this book in the modern day. So I'll be giving this 4 out of 5 stars, and I would highly recommend it to fans of older literature, gothic horror. If you're interested in vampire stories and just want to see where it all began, I do not think this is a must-read, and I definitely think there are plenty of vampire stories that have surpassed it. But all in all, it is very easy to see why this is a classic, why it was so influential, and I am very glad that I read it. So with that, thank you all so much for watching. Let me know some of your favorite vampire stories in the comments down below, and I will be back very soon for a new video.